There are many out there who wrongly think that Alexander Akimov is the man who pressed the AZ5 button on the night of April the 26th, 1986, at Unit 4 of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. In fact, it was the Senior Reactor Control Engineer, Leonid Toptunov. At just 25, he had only been operating single-handedly in that role for 2 months, and a bright future lay ahead of him. But what led to Leonid Toptunov working at the nuclear power plant in the first place? How did he reach such a prestigious position? And should he rightfully be known as the man who blew up Chernobyl? Born in Mykolaiivka, a village in the Sumy Oblast of Ukraine, on the 16th of August 1960, to Fyodor and Vera Toptonov, Leonid grew up surrounded by scientists and soldiers. His father, a senior military officer who supervised the Soviet Union's space program. At the age of 7 months, he was a witness to Yuri Gagarin's flight into space, the first man to leave the confines of Earth. At the age of 13, Toptonov moved to Tallinn in Estonia, as his father's work led to him becoming an attaché at the Vigatil rocket engine plant. But he kept his experience in physics and mathematics from his time around the scientists of the Soviet space program. Toptonov was gifted in mathematics, and at the age of 16, he enrolled for a position at the Moscow Engineering and Physics Institute. The odds were against him. Many people around him had sat the test numerous times, with as many as 4 people vying for a single place. Toptonov, however, succeeded in securing a place at the institute. Despite his mother pleading that he didn't go, he left Estonia for Moscow at 17, and began his course in atomic power plant engineering. He was almost expelled from his 4-year-long course early, after taking up karate, considered banned in the Soviet Union, and boxing, which led to him getting a broken nose. There's also a story where, after one class, drunk, he fought his thermodynamics tutor in the bathroom, giving him a black eye. But this appears not to be true. What actually happened, according to his roommate, was just a normal argument with another student that escalated, and all of this was witnessed by the tutor. Despite this, Toptonov remained a student, bailed out by his father. When he finished the course, Toptonov decided to focus on a diploma project identifying irregularities in the performance of RBMK reactors using acoustics. He was transferred to Chernobyl Unit 4, under construction at the time, and worked his way through the ranks, participating in quality control of the reactor itself. He climbed inside of the reactor to monitor pipes, inspect for defects such as cracks, and to work on his diploma. Once Unit 4 was launched, being one of the people to witness the moment, Toptonov decided to pursue a career as a Senior Reactor Control Engineer, becoming one of the people who would manage the reactor itself on a shift. This required months of studying for safety exams, health checks, and security screenings by the KGB. Once these were complete, he was then given the opportunity to observe qualified Senior Reactor Control Engineers, and on the 10th of September 1985, following the completion of exams, Toptonov received the opportunity to shadow SIUR Neritin in Control Room 4. The order was signed by many people involved in operating the reactor, including Dyatlov, Akimov, Neritin, and Perevozchenko. By February 1986, Toptonov had completed his shadowing and was now a truly qualified Senior Reactor Control Engineer, almost 3 years after he first arrived at Chernobyl. Outside of the plant, Toptonov would take the opportunity to set up a gym in his dormitory, and run a physics and mathematics class at one of the many schools in the city of Pripyat, the satellite city to the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. His work had also brought him one thing he never had in life: an older brother. He found it in his shift supervisor, Alexander Akimov. Both shared a patronym. It was as if they had the same father. Both a mentor and a friend, they grew close, and often went fishing together at the Pripyat River. Toptonov himself had supposedly been aware of one of the many forgotten oddities about the reactor. Following one of the safety exams, Toptonov reportedly remarked that some of the documents referred to a power increase when the control rods were inserted in certain configurations, instead of reducing the power as they should have. He didn't know it, but he discovered the positive scram effect. And this brings us to April the 25th, 1986, the day of the scheduled shutdown of Unit 4, and Toptonov is scheduled to work the night shift before and afterwards. On the first night shift, Toptonov was in charge of lowering the reactor power down in preparation for the experiment, which he began at 1 am, down from 3100 megawatts of power, stabilizing at 1600 by the end of the shift. It was at this time that Toptonov was first accused of making a mistake, although he wasn't at fault at all. As the power was reduced, xenon began to accumulate in the reactor, resulting in poisoning of the reactor core. As a result, Toptonov began to remove control rods to keep the power steady. When the Scala computer gave its printout of reactor parameters that morning, it gave a reading of 13.2, below the minimum permissible operating reactivity margin of 15. In reality, the Scala computer had made an error, not counting the 12 automatic control rods, meaning the true operating reactivity margin was 18. This information was passed around in the daily briefing that morning. According to regulations, if Scala showed that the operating reactivity margin went below 15 rods, even if it was just a computational error, the reactor should have been shut down. But this rule was dismissed by the senior workers. With the reactor scheduled to be shut down later that day, this regulation was considered a mere formality, and the harshest punishment Toptonov received was a demand from Alexander Kovalenko, the head of the reactor shop, to provide an explanatory note the following morning for how he let the operating reactivity margin fall so low. Toptonov returned home and got some rest in preparation for the night shift, and his last shift before he went on a short vacation. As he got ready for work, he was informed that the reactor had not been shut down, and he would be conducting the shutdown of Unit 4. Following this, Toptonov tried to convince his friend, Alexander Korol, to join him, so Korol could observe the shutdown, but he declined. Toptonov went to work alone. When Toptonov arrived, power was already being reduced to the final level before the turbine rundown program could begin, and he conducted the handover smoothly. The power continued down, lowering to 700 megawatts of thermal output, the minimum requirement for the turbine program in the procedure, and then falling below. We'll pause here. It is still unclear as to why this actually occurred, but there is now strong evidence that it was a deliberate choice to reduce the amount of steam dumped when the valves to the turbine were closed. At 28 minutes past midnight on April 26th, a series of automatic control rod regulator failures and a sudden loss of boiling in the core caused the power to plunge to as low as 30 megawatts of thermal output. While you may think that this is a severe problem, almost shutting down the reactor, to the operators it was not. The situation could be remedied. Yuri Tregub was the first to start raising control rods, then Akimov, and finally Toptonov, the least experienced of the three. Reportedly at some point, Toptonov refused to raise the power, not out of fear of potential instability, but simply a lack of experience. At one point, Tregub, noticing that Toptonov was pulling the control rods unevenly, mostly from one half of the reactor, began to guide Toptonov on what control rods to withdraw from the reactor. When Dyatlov returned to the control room, he saw the group withdrawing all the control rods and authorized them to continue, not concerned by the power drop either, and they were able to withdraw enough control rods to keep the power at 200 megawatts without violating the operating reactivity margin, enough to run the test. A major learning curve for Toptonov, but doing so was an accomplishment. But the preparations for the turbine rundown program continued, keeping Toptonov waiting longer and longer. First, 2 more main circulation pumps were started, and Stolyachuk continued to rapidly increase the amount of cold feed water entering the reactor. Xenon poisoning continued. All of these factors forced both automatic and manual control rod withdrawal. At 1 AM, Toptonov reported to Dyatlov that the operating reactivity margin was roughly 18 or 19 control rods. By 1:23 AM, this value had fallen to as low as 10 or 12. Disaster was mere seconds away. Officially, the reactor was supposed to scram at the start of the test. However, to allow for the turbine vibrations to be measured, the turbine had been disconnected earlier in the night, which required the trip protection to be disabled. This meant that the reactor kept running. Seconds passed. The water flow to the reactor decreased, and power began to rise slowly. Automatic control rods descended, stopping the increase. At this point, Toptonov turned to Akimov, asking what he should do. Akimov, on the other side of the control room, motioned to the AZ5 button, and then returned back to watching the program. Everything was calm. There were no signs of what was going to unfold seconds later. According to the teletype, Toptonov pressed the AZ5 button at 1:23:39. This would be recorded on Scala just 1 second later. The control rods began to descend, the graphite water displacers displacing the water at the bottom of the reactor, and the power surged. In an instant, Toptonov watched the power initially decrease, and then jump from 230 megawatts to 320, and then a second later, it climbed again to 530. A noise filled the room, like a car engine that struggled to start up. And then an explosion. A few panicked cries, and then a second explosion. The lights failed momentarily, as the power supply was lost, and then the diesel generators, a series of batteries and inverters, all came online to supply power once more. And that was it. With one push of a button, the thing he was supposed to do, Toptonov had caused the explosion of Chernobyl Reactor 4. After the explosion, Toptonov was one of the first to see that the control rods had only descended between a third and a half of the way into the reactor. Try as he might, he could not get them to descend any further. Unbeknownst to him, that was because they were no longer inside the reactor at all. They had been vaporized in the explosion. He rushed to try and find a way to insert them, and help with the main task at hand, cooling what they thought was a reactor on the verge of a meltdown. When the chief shift supervisor Boris Rogozhin arrived at the control room, he immediately pressed Dyatlov and Toptonov on what they had done. Dyatlov defended Toptonov's actions, saying they had merely pressed AZ5 when the reactor had exploded. Rogozhin turned to Toptonov and asked him directly if he had, which Toptonov confirmed. Once Rogozhin had left, Dyatlov ordered Toptonov to also leave the control room and make his way to the main administration building, but Toptonov, perhaps feeling guilt over the explosion, refused. Eventually, Dyatlov forced him to at least move to the safety of Unit 3, as there was nothing he could do. But within minutes he returned. Again he was ordered to leave, but once more he came back, waiting for any orders to assist. By morning there was one task he had been given to do. Alongside Akimov, Nechayev, Uskov and Orlov, he ascended to room 714-2, a narrow passageway with a series of valves that, when opened, would allow water to flow from the steam separators down into the reactor. The room was flooded with radioactive water, and the further into the room one traversed, the higher the radioactivity. Toptonov, Nechayev, and Akimov were allocated to the far end, and they stood in the ankle-deep water as more showered over them, using a miner's lamp for light, trying to open the valves. By the time they left, Toptonov was vomiting, and both he and Akimov had contracted lethal dosages of radiation. When they returned to the control room, it was obvious that they weren't going to be able to work much longer, so they tried to explain their work to the day shift that had arrived in the control room while they were opening the valves. But this was impossible. Between sentences, they had to run to the bin to throw up, until there was nothing left. And then Akimov and Toptonov departed for the infirmary. On the way out, Toptonov collapsed and had to be carried away by others, leaving Akimov to slowly make his way there alone. Both Akimov and Toptonov were quickly whisked from the nuclear power plant to Hospital No. 126 in Pripyat, where Akimov recovered much more quickly. By the evening, Toptonov had developed a dark brown nuclear tan, struggling to speak as his tongue was swollen. When asked about the operating reactivity margin, he said the last value he saw was 18, something corroborated by Akimov. That evening, Toptonov joined the first of the extraordinary convoy, transporting all the most severely affected patients from Hospital No. 126 to Kiev, and then a chartered flight to Moscow. On April 29th, Toptonov sent a telegram to his parents in Estonia. "Mama, I am in hospital. I feel okay." And then the address to Moscow Hospital No. 6. At once, his parents set off for their son. The most pressing concern for Toptonov and other patients afflicted by acute radiation syndrome was restoring their white blood cell count, which would require a hematopoietic stem cell transplant. For many, no tissue match could be found, but Toptonov was one of the exceptions. His mother, Vera Toptonova, was a viable donor match, and stem cells were taken from her and transplanted into her son. But it was never going to be enough. It was estimated that Toptonov had received 1,300 rems of radiation. To put that into perspective, that is almost 45 times the amount of radiation the average person in the United States will receive in their lifetimes, and twice what is considered to be a lethal dose. Toptonov's condition deteriorated, as he tried to determine what had happened. When his mother asked him how it had all happened that night, all Toptonov could reply with was, "Mama, I did everything right. I did everything according to the regulations." Toptonov's condition continued to worsen. On May 11th, the same day Akimov succumbed to his radiation dosage, Toptonov was struggling with the serious pain of hairs falling off of his head, landing on open injuries. His mother suggested that he have his head shaved, but Toptonov declined, calling it a waste of money when he could just pull the hair out of his head so easily. On May 14th, Leonid Toptunov would pass away. Radiation damage covered 90% of his skin. He woke up gasping for breath and suffocated. The bone marrow procedure had not had enough time to work. He was just 25 years old. The same day Toptonov died, his funeral had been prepared at the Matinsko Cemetery in Moscow. His parents followed his body to the truck that would take him to his final resting place, but as soon as they began to seal his body inside the zinc coffin, they protested, wanting it to only be sealed before he was buried. The undertakers relented when Fyodor Toptonov lay himself down on the road in front of the truck, telling them to drive over him if they were going to seal the coffin. Toptonov remains buried in the same zinc coffin at the Matinsko Cemetery. Initially a simple plot that was then concreted over to create a giant monument to immortalise him and the other victims of the disaster. Today, the carved portrait on top of his grave is ordained with flowers, and he is regarded as a hero. But this was not always the case. When the Soviet Union was deciding who to blame, they included Toptonov, Akimov and Perevozchenko in the list, alongside the 6 men who would be charged and held at trial for the disaster in 1987, sending a letter to their families explaining how they were at fault, and that if they hadn't died, they too would be sent to prison. When Dyatlov heard of this, he sent his own letter to Fyodor and Vera, proclaiming their son to be a hero, and lamenting how the real criminals had got away with it, while making the operators seem like troglodytes, as he put it. In October of 1993, Toptonov's parents moved to Kiev, where they were told that the Soviet Union had planned to relocate the bodies. However, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the plans were scrapped shortly thereafter. The first good news for the Toptonov family in years came in 2008, when Toptonov was publicly exonerated for his role in the Chernobyl disaster, and was instead posthumously awarded the Order of Courage, 3rd degree, for his bravery on the night. This positivity would not last, as the medal was stolen sometime later. On April 26, 2010, exactly 24 years after the accident, Fyodor Toptonov passed away. Vera Toptonova is still believed to be alive today. While Toptonov may have been publicly exonerated, there are still many who consider him and other operators guilty for the explosion. But is he? To answer that question, we must consider if what he did was the correct thing to do. If he did everything correctly, then he can't be at fault. Did Toptonov cause the sudden loss of power? No. According to current scientific studies, including by the International Atomic Energy Agency, the loss of power was caused by a combination of measurement errors and what Dyatlov would later describe as a faulty system. Nor was raising the power a violation of procedure, if it was done quickly enough, which it was in this case. Not only that, but there were several senior people surrounding Toptonov. All of them were in support of raising the power, and we also know from research that losses in power and subsequent raising were assessed as the correct decisions by investigators after the accident. Did Toptonov knowingly violate the operating reactivity margin? No. The computer data shows that Toptonov was able to stabilise the reactor at an operating reactivity margin of 18 control rods, but the withdrawal of control rods to compensate for loss of boiling in the core reduced it further, something that was beyond his control. Furthermore, there were no live recordings of the ORM value in the control room, making it nigh impossible to monitor. Back then, it wasn't considered an important value. Did Toptonov know that pressing AZ5 would cause the explosion? Again, no. While he may have learned that inserting control rods could lead to a power surge, this doesn't mean he would have known that in this circumstance the power surge would occur, nor that the power surge could be so great that the reactor might explode. There is no major fault to pin on Toptonov for the explosion. Everything he did fell under procedure. But this changes nothing. Toptonov will forever be, innocent or not, the person who pressed AZ5, and in doing so, to the public he will always be the man who blew up Chernobyl.